All right. My name is Matthew DeSilva. I'm a reporter for Quartz, or QZ.com, and I'm thrilled to be joined by Arthur Breitman as well as Steve Crocker. I'm looking forward to our conversation. We do have a gentleman who's going to be kind of moseying around the room, ready to take questions. So if at any time you do think of a question, please feel free to raise your hand, and he'll come bring the mic to you. That'll help kind of guide our discussion, and hopefully this will be a fruitful one. So thank you for being here. Now, I don't know exactly how familiar everyone is with the entire crypto universe with regard to Tezos, so I think that a good starting point would be to have Arthur kind of explain, can you give us a 1-minute recap of Tezos over the last 2 years? I know that that's quite a challenge.
Well, Tezos is an older product than that. It's a product that started in 2014, and the main idea behind it is that if you look at open source software today, the ways that governance works in open source software is through something called fork-based governance. And the idea is that if you have a piece of software and you want to make it different, and you can copy the code base if it's open source, and you can have your own version, and different people can have their own version. And that's been the de facto mode of governance for blockchains. The difficulty with this is that it works well for software that many people can use independently. It doesn't work well if you have a singleton, like a single blockchain that you want people to use. And Tezos comes from the realization that this is a process that requires governance, essentially. It's an acknowledgement of the need for governance in the space, and the way it proceeds is by essentially trying to create formal rules for having a self-amending system, so a system that can amend its own governance rules and progressively become better and better and try to improve. And so it started as just an idea in 2014, and it's a network that launched and went live last year in June.
Before we proceed, could you pull your mic up a little bit? I just want to make sure everyone can hear you. Now, one of the words that you mentioned there is governance, which is, of course, the topic of this panel. And I think that would be a great starting point to kind of define the things that we are trying to achieve in this space. So, Dr. Crocker, as well as Arthur, could you tell me, what do you mean by governance? Or why don't we start with you, Dr. Crocker? What do you consider governance?
Well, there's kind of a couple of different things that, in my mind, are the essence of governance. You have a system, whether it's blockchain or some other system, and I should say, I'm here as a bit of a ringer. I was one of the early people involved in the creation of the internet and the protocols on the internet and the processes for creating the protocols. And so somebody thought it was a good idea to drag me out of the museum and see if I had anything useful to say with respect to the governance issues for blockchains. We'll see whether or not it turns out to be useful. So what comes to mind, to my mind, with respect to governance are at least two things. One is nothing stays the same, and so you have the change control problem. How do you make changes in a system that's up and running? And that in itself has kind of two parts. After you've agreed on the change.
Oh, there you go.
Sound like the sound went away. After you've agreed upon the change, how do you actually propagate that in a smooth way so that things don't break while everybody's using it? And then the preceding problem of how do you get agreement on such change, which is a point that Arthur referred to. The other is oversight. The other big governance issue in my mind is oversight for making sure that people and organizations obey the agreed upon norms of behavior. And that can be a whole range of things from hard laws and police at one level to social structures and ostracizing or just market forces that help push people in the right direction.
Okay.
So that's sort of the perspective I come from with respect to governance.
Arthur, how about you? When you think about governance, how do you define it?
I like to. I think of governance as it's a process where you have multiple inputs and you need to make a decision about a shared resource. So that's a process. Yeah, that's a process by which several parties with different interests make decisions about a shared resource. And in that case, that resource might just be the rules that govern a protocol or a system.
Would it be fair to say that governance is perhaps a process of finding consensus?
The thing is like it doesn't have to be consensus. It could be a decision. In some sense, if you have, dictatorship is a mode of governance. You have a dictator and they just make all the decision. It may not be a good mode of governance, but it's, I think it would fit the definition.
I see. Okay. Now, one of the things that Dr. Crocker is well known for is having created requests for comment, one of the earliest versions of kind of developing internet protocols. And this was kind of a collaborative effort that spanned across many different universities. That's a model that's actually been adopted within some of the crypto communities. For example, in the Ethereum community, there's the Ethereum request for comment. And I was wondering, when you kind of designed that process for people submitting ideas, it was obviously in kind of an analog world initially. And I was wondering, how do you think that kind of process of collaboration has changed over the last 50 years or so?
Yeah, well, it was an accident, and it was a small thing that lasted and evolved far beyond anything that I had in mind. So just to very briefly cover the story, when the ARPANET, which was sort of the founding piece of what became the internet, when that project was started off, the bottom layer of how do you build the transport mechanisms, the design of the routers and the long distance lines and the packet switching, all that, that was done in an organized, formal way with contracts and planning and so forth. The layers above, what are the computers connected to the network going to say to each other, assuming that the underlying packet transport mechanism works as planned? What are those machines going to say to each other was left kind of undefined, but what happened was that this network was presented as a gift that couldn't be refused on the research sites that were already being supported by the agency at DARPA that was supporting the research. And so a few of us from these different sites were called together and we began to talk to each other. We were not given a charter, we were not given an explicit schedule or budget or objectives or anything, and it grew organically. So we started talking to each other, and as we talked intermittently over several months, we said, okay, we better start writing some of this down. And we were around a table, not much bigger than one of these tables actually, very few of us. And we dealt out assignments, writing assignments. So you've been talking about this topic, you write that down, et cetera. And then I took on the additional trivial chore of organizing the notes. And over the next couple of weeks, I found myself very nervous about the organization process because I worried about what counter reaction it would have. Who are you guys? Who put you in charge, et cetera? We were young, much younger then. And so after stalling for a couple of times, late one night I said, I got to write something down. And I said, okay, these notes are going to be extremely informal. They have no status. They don't have to be complete. You can write a question without an answer. You can do whatever you want. All you got to do is put your name and a date and a title on it. And I will hand you, and I'll hand you a number on it. And you write it first. I'll give you the number. I didn't want a lot of holes in the sequence. And then following a suggestion from one of the guys, I used the term request for comments. I said, and we'll label every one of them, no matter how formal it looks or how informal it looks, as a request for comments, as a way of stimulating the conversation. So you say, well, where's the governance model? And the answer was there was precisely zero governance model in there. What evolved over time, and this is turned out to be extremely important, is that rather than have a formal group that says, we're in charge and we'll make the decisions and you have to implement it, it became a consensus process in two different respects. It became a consensus process in that the design of the protocols was everybody's allowed to participate, and the protocols would eventually go through multiple iterations and people would agree on them. And then the separate consensus process, or a separate part of it, was a market-based thing where just because it's been declared a standard, and now I'm fast forwarding over the way the Internet Engineering Task Force works, does not mean that everybody has to implement it. But if you don't implement it, you won't interoperate with everybody else. And so it became market-based as opposed to a sort of fiat system. Several years ago, I was called upon to explain how the how the internet worked in a group that was remarkably, well, it was old line telephone people and national security telephone people, and there was a very distinguished gentleman who listened to me, and he said, so you don't have any standards? So I said, well, let me explain it again. And I went through the whole process of how the IETF works and consensus process, and he said, so you don't have any standards. Let me tell you what standards are. We go into a room, we write that down, we publish that, and everybody has to implement that. And my response was, yeah, so that's why we're knocking over the telephone company, and then we agreed not to have a discussion anymore. One way or another, there has to be a way for consensus process to work, and at the same time, there are excesses no matter how you design a system. If you have a fiat system, then you get arbitrary decisions made by people who may or may not be acting in everybody's best interest. And on the other end of the spectrum, if you have a wide open total consensus process and everybody has to be heard and one objection stops the world, then you get nothing done. And so the challenge is, how do you find that balance? And then you have the mechanical aspects of how do you change a system that's in progress? How do you rebuild the plane while it's in flight is one of the ways that's talked about.
One of the things, or two of the things that I have kind of noticed are that the way that consensus has evolved might have allowed for faster innovation, but at the same time more impersonal innovation, especially as people are kind of collaborating online as opposed to, perhaps via letters or, just literally writing things. So I was wondering, when you think about kind of how that kind of collaboration is today, do you think that it's more antagonistic? Do you think that, basically, I know that it's a different time period, but how do you see the positives and negatives of how innovation happens today versus how it happened when you were working on ARPANET?
Yeah, good question. With apologies, there's actually two big points buried in there. Mm-hmm. One of the key things that worked well for us in the ARPANET days and generally in the internet, and which I would counsel very strongly, is to try to divide problems up into small pieces. In the case of the internet protocols, the watchword was layers, protocol layers, and we made the layers as thin as possible so that you could evolve one layer, you could create new layers, you could separate the issues. And so you don't have to get everybody in the entire community in the same room talking about every little detail about every little thing. So you want to separate the pieces. And the more you can do that, the better off you are. And the advantages are quite obvious from scaling and everything. The other aspect is more complicated in that we had a huge advantage back in the early days in that we had a single sponsor. We weren't in competition with each other. All of the motivations were toward cooperation. In today's world, financial objectives dominate, and that's a two-sided coin, to borrow a phrase, mm-hmm. Because it provides the wherewithal to actually make things happen, but it also provides a lot of tension in that different people have different motivations. You have winners and losers, and you got to find some way to modulate that. You can't tamp it out entirely, and if you did, then you wouldn't have any resources to work with. And on the other hand, you've got to have some way of getting people to congregate around a common good one way or another. And getting back to my first point, and the more that you can separate the issues so that different people can go do different things and it doesn't destroy the whole, the better off you are.
So another question that I have, and I'll direct this one to you, Arthur, is what are some of your favorite governance kind of examples? Perhaps not necessarily crypto specific, but what kind of models of governance have you seen in kind of the wider world that you seek to emulate in some way?
That's a good question. So I do like the rough consensus model of the AETF, and that's generally been used in the internet. The one thing that I do worry about is when I hear about this like market validation that if you switch, if everyone switches, you have an incentive to switch, because this basically describes a bistable equilibrium where maybe everyone's going to switch, maybe not everyone's going to switch, and so there's like a bit of a sharp discontinuity here, which I think can lead to capture. Other models that I do like the models of governance in the Republic of Venice. I think they were very interesting. What was particularly cool about it is they had early versions of approval voting. There are a lot of people who are really into voting theory and what kind of votes are harder to manipulate than others. And approval voting, it's a very simple concept. You basically see a list of proposals and you just say which ones you like, the list of all the proposals you like, and then you tally which proposal was the most upvoted, for example. So that's a very simple model, but it's been, it worked very well, and Venice became fantastically wealthy under its model of governance. What's more, it had this model of governance at a time where basically the rest of Europe was into feudalism. So that's I think that's one source of inspiration.
What about you, Dr. Crocker? Sorry, the question is, what kind of models of governance have you seen kind of in the wider world, or perhaps in your personal life, that you think have worked well? Which ones do you admire?
The reason for my silence is I'm running through a long list of the examples of governance that I've seen and trying to pick out the ones that have worked well.
Maybe the biggest, maybe the biggest failures or kind of like unexpected failures might be another kind of useful topic.
Which newspapers do you read? Well, the things that work well are the ones where you have at least a modicum of common interests, as I try to describe, and a clear benefit to the whole if everybody understands and subscribes to that, and a willingness to at least balance one's own interests with the interests of the whole. There's a lot of ways in which things go wrong, and apologies for being negative, but I think it's important to guard against those and then take strong action if the governance mechanisms that have been agreed to go off the rails. So that's a very tricky business because I've been involved in a lot of situations where some set of rules or procedures are agreed to as if they were golden and immutable, and things go off the rails, and then people say, well, we have no ability to change it because that's what we agreed to. And I think that's very, very dangerous. All of the governance processes that we live with, whether they're in the small, in small groups, or whether or not we're talking about nations, one always has to have a sense of, are these rules working for us as a whole?
Now, in a 2009 article for the New York Times, you'd written that and you'd written of your time with ARPANET, that it probably helped that in those days we avoided patents and other restrictions. Without any financial incentive to control the protocols, it was much easier to reach agreement. Kind of continuing along that theme, what are some of the things that are threats to governance? Money is obviously one. What kind of issues, what other issues have you confronted that have really derailed projects?
Well, money, of course, but probably the most important thing to do, and if you don't do it, it's where things go wrong, is getting a common ethic of a common agreement on what the vocabulary means, what the objectives are, so that people entering into the space come sort of educated with the right, let me edit that, with the same expectations as the people who are already in the room, if you will, so that, and a clear articulation of those, what those expectations are, and what the rules of the game are, is what I would say is probably the thing that is most helpful. And the lack of that, or big disputes about that, or hidden agendas, or not so hidden agendas, but just unspoken, are the undermining. And so you got to be able to attract the people who have motivations that are help things work, and at the same time dissuade the people who want to undermine the system from participating if you can. Tricky problem, because it depends who's in the room. I spent a certain amount of time thinking about which systems people trust and which systems people don't trust. And you can do simple games like used car salesman or stock salesman or stockbrokers, and you know, you're not all booing, but I could imagine. You know, New York firefighters, hey, and then you can ask sort of what it is about those different groups that yields higher degrees of trust versus lower degrees of trust. And you have to have a fairly high degree of trust in a governance system, or else you don't have a governance system that works at all.
Now, one of the things that's been kind of useful for the Tezos community is obviously Tezos' blog and kind of explaining things to the community. How has Tezos kind of tried to engage with the wider crypto community and kind of explain the concepts that are specific to Tezos?
I mean, Tezos itself is a network, so it doesn't engage with the community.
Well, the Tezos Foundation.
So, well, I'm not a part of the Tezos Foundation, so
okay.
It's not my place to say how they communicate with the community, but I can tell you how I communicate with the community, or how the community communicates to the broader community. I think that's the most interesting thing. I think one of the driver of the growth of this network has it that a lot of their community have been very active and have been evangelizing for projects. You know, obviously the negative side of that is that you see a lot of tribalism, I would say, in the space of cryptocurrencies, but you also see a lot of evangelism, and I think that's very, very positive. And you know, the best ambassadors, I would say, of this project have been the community who are, you know, who go out and explain the benefits of governance and engage in debate and engage in discussion on a matter. So I would say that's very it's very interesting to. It's very interesting to see, because you see idea evolves, and you know, even inside of a project you will see factions form and inform, and you know, it can be positive because it can be a driver for ideas and for debates. It can also, you know, create its own tribalism inside, and so one of the things that I do worry about sometimes in governance is, you know, ideally you have a governance decision to make. You would want everyone to just be aligned with, you know, whatever is the best decision, or try to find that. But then you will find, you could find intermediary other motives. For example, saying, well, you know, this group is in favor of that, and I'm in favor of that group for other reasons. And so you can see these sort of things play out. But it's pretty early to tell, because, you know, the governance of Tezos is very young. It's going through its first vote now. So the model that Tezos speaks for governance is a simple model. But it's also, you know, to your point about not having to having some slack in the rules. There's some slack in the rules, and there are checks and balances in the system. You know, it takes time. It has a possibility of fork-based governance, so it adds a lot of slack. It is mostly, I would say that right now it is mostly a way of saying, okay, have we made a decision? And if we've made a decision, let's try to ratify it. You know, people see on-chain governance as a decision mechanisms. And maybe a better way of seeing it is as a ratification of an existing decision. So I would say that's an important part of it.
Now, one of the things that you mentioned in there was tribalism. I was wondering what have you kind of done to kind of mitigate that tribalism, and what things do you think should be done?
It's tough, because, you know, I can't go around millions of years of evolutionary history of you know, human beings are tribalistic people. It's really in our nature, and the overriding influence on that is culture. And you know, as much as I can, I try to especially when looking at other projects, for example, see the value of that these other projects have, see what they can bring, and try to think about these things from a rational perspective, and not from them versus us.
What do you think is driving the tribalism in the first place?
I think human nature.
In what respects?
I mean, it is part of human nature. Human is a political animal. Human beings like to form alliances with each other. It's like, I would say, a human being in the wild by themselves, they're not very useful. They can't really survive. We are a species that survive in bands of people, and we bond with each other by creating these ties. It's very, very deeply ingrained.
When you look at something like the XRP army, for example, that might be kind of, do you think that's something that's kind of driven by greed, or where do you think that what do you think the root is of the XRP army?
So I haven't looked so much in this phenomenon. I read a bit about it. There's some people say they're bots, some people say, and I know that they get a bad rap, but to be honest, I think that, I think, like what I read is that I think they're very, very motivated people, and I think they come from a place of moral outrage, and I agree with that, and so and I do like that. I do like that aspect. There's a lot of people. I personally am not a fan of like XRP or Ripple as a project. I think it's flown in different ways. It's not for me, but I also think that people accuse Ripple of all sorts of things, and there's been a lot of aggressivity, I would say, in the space against Ripple. And I don't think that aggressivity is warranted. And the fact that they would react with more outrage, with aggressivity, actually sounds natural.
Okay. I want to just remind everyone, we have about 2 minutes left. I just want to open it up for questions if anyone has questions for Arthur or Dr. Crocker. And, yep, nope, oh, no question, okay.
Over there.
Oh, go ahead.
There's two.
The one that's closest to us. Oh, there's three. Okay, great. The gentleman in the pink. I think, yes, that's you.
So I study rules professionally. I'm an institutionalist, and the way rules operate in the real world is actually structurally pretty different than they operate when law is code. A lot of rules are default rules. They're not meant to coordinate behavior most of the time. They simply exist. They create sort of a shadow rule for when things go wrong. And so I was wondering if I could hear the panelists' thoughts about challenges in creating law as code when it operates structurally in a pretty different way in many instances.
Arthur, I think that might be for you.
It's about shadow rules and how shadow rules operates underneath. So I think that's important. I would say that's a point of having formal governance. And one of the points I try to make is you don't have no governance. If you don't have governance, then you will have an implicit governance model that will exist. But as soon as you start with a shared resource and you end up with a decision, then you've had a governance process. It's just informal. And I think the more informal your governance process, the more powerful these shadow rules are going to be. And part of the impetus for having a formal governance process is to avoid this type of hidden power.
Okay, I think we have time for a couple more questions.
Yes, thank you so much for the panel. I would like to ask you something, Dr. Crocker. That is, when you started opening your network back in the 40s and 50s, how did you permission a new node? So, what were the rules for you to open the access to new people to your network? How did you protect yourself from that?
Able to hear?
Is that directed to me?
Yes.
So I apologize. I think I got the gist of the question. It was as we expanded the network, how did we control who was admitted and what did we deal with it? So interesting problem. The origins of the internet started with government funding, and so the admission rule was very simple. If the government was willing to pay for you to be on the network, then you got on the network, and if they weren't, then you didn't. That didn't scale very far, and there were lots of pressure to expand. And then eventually, the whole thing was opened up and commercial ISPs were created and so forth. One of the things that was not anticipated thoroughly enough was the bad behavior of many people who would try to break into systems, coupled with the bad structure of the operating systems and other systems on the network, which made it easy to break in. And so we had a huge security problem, which we fixed a long time ago. I know none of you ever have any problems with this anymore. But it was an area that we underplayed back in the 70s and 80s. And I was being facetious, of course. It's a huge problem and persists even to this day. And so you got to try to look ahead a little bit to see what happens as you scale things up. An important lesson for everybody who designs a system, that as you scale things up, the structure changes, the dynamics are completely different from what things are in the small.
Do we have another question over there? Or? No? Okay. I want to close with one final question for both of you, or each of you. And the question, and it's not an easy one, is about manipulation. And obviously when there's a governance system in place, there's an incentive for bad actors quite often to try to manipulate. And I was wondering how you think about that, especially at the earliest stages of designing a protocol.
You go first.
Well, so the way this is often described in the space of cryptocurrencies is prevention of Sybil attacks. And it's especially important in scenarios where you're in the internet with anonymous actors, and so someone could pretend that they are many, many different people, and actually they're just there's just one person. So if you don't have something that's really rooted in identity, it's a problem. So the first thing you need is a source of Sybil resistance. And one of the idea of Bitcoin was to use hash power, owning computing power, spending resources as a source of Sybil resistance. What's tried to do in Tezos and in other so-called proof-of-stake systems is to use the tokens themselves as a source of Sybil resistance. And there's a bit of technicality because you have to kind of bootstrap because your system needs to be secure, so you can have stake, and you have a stake to secure the system, but at the end of the day, you can make it work. And some people look at this and will say, well, does it mean, if you have more stakes, then it means you have more of a say? Does it mean that, it favors the rich, for example, over other people? But the way I think, again, to go back to my point about ratification, the point of the system is largely to show that you have very broad consensus. And if your consensus is very, very broad, in some sense, once you've achieved that, it doesn't really matter how it is ratified on chain. What matters is mostly, having evidence that there's very wide support for it. So that's one approach. There are difficulties with this. So some of the difficulties include bribing. Once it's kind of the ring of Gyges. I would say the internet. It's a Smith where, which inspired Lord of the Ring. It's a Smith where this shepherd finds a ring that makes him invisible, and Plato, I think, asks, well, would you act ethically if you were invisible and you would never get caught? And that's what we have when we try to design network with anonymous actors on the internet. The question is, are people who would never accept bribe in real life, if it's on the internet and never get caught, will they accept bribe? How can these things be shifted? And I think the solution to that is to, again, had a lot of delays, had a lot of controls, have very high thresholds. For example, like a vote in Tezos requires something like an 80% majority. So you set very conservative parameter, and then progressively you build up from that. You build up your system, you build up your governance rules in order to be more sophisticated and better able to handle those attacks. But it is definitely the biggest challenge. One approach that Bitcoin has tried is to say, well, obviously there's a risk for governance. Bad actors could influence governance. And so we see governance as a backdoor, and we don't want to have a backdoor, so we'll design a system without any governance. And you can try to have very, very strong cultural norms against making any changes, and if you don't make any changes, then you don't really have a governance because there's no output, right? And that can work. The difficulty is that this is a space that has had an explosion of innovation in the past 10 years in terms of what can be done now with smart contracts, what can be done with privacy. And if you've decided that you were going to shut yourself to governance forever because you want to avoid any possibility of interference from bad actors, I think you're leaving on the table a lot of very valuable innovation that have come to this space.
Okay.
Just very briefly,
Yes.
Sunlight is the best disinfectant is a standard aphorism. There's a big challenge, a big tension between privacy and anonymity on the one hand versus clarity about who's doing what and why they're doing it and so forth, getting visibility into what's happening and who's doing it. I think it's important that there be sufficient information about all aspects of system operation and personal behavior and institutional behavior. Anonymity and protecting privacy are very important, but I don't think that they are by themselves the primary sort of overriding value that ought to trump everything else. Otherwise, you get chaos. You obviously don't want too much intrusion. You don't want too much government control and so forth. So there's a balancing issue there. But to your point, to your question about how do you prevent manipulation, first you have to detect it. First you have to make sure that it's visible. And then to your point about consensus, there has to be a common understanding about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And in order to get that, you have to have the visibility, and then you can decide how you're going to deal with it. But first, getting that information visible and out, I think, is the precursor to solving the problems.
Well, thank you very much to Arthur. Thank you very much, Dr. Crocker.
Thank you.
This has been a pleasure.
Thank you all.